Thank you. So I'm a professor of bioethics at the University of Otago, and thank you very much for making it possible to talk. It's lovely to meet a number of you in person for the first time. Brian and I know very well virtually. It's the first time we've been in the same room, so it's all good. So this isn't so much a paper, but it's a response to my somewhat limited reading of papers defending the right to mental integrity and not interfering with mental states. So that's one aspect I want to. The second is I want to revisit some things that I said before about well-being, or kind of an account of welfare, which I think is responsive to changes to our mental life that result from a couple of kinds of interference that we might think of as being interference in the person or interference in the body. I'm particularly interested in things that might result in a change in our dispositions, or the way in which we react to things in the world brought about by artificial means. So this is from Douglas and Forsberg. This is from a few years ago, a chapter, and they talk about these kind of key cases where the right to bodily integrity is invoked, and making an analogy with the right to mental integrity, and that all seems sensible to me so far. Here are some cases from Buglitz and Reinhard Merkel, which are supposed to be cases of where the right to mental integrity has been violated. So the first one is a restaurant chain struggling with decreasing sales, so has a welcome drink and they dose the customers so that they become hungrier and eat more of the food. So this is like a bad thing, and lots of them do things along these lines. Another similar example. So this is one where a psychiatrist uses TMS to alter brain mix, which make it deceit and lying increasingly harder and easier to detect. It's kind of another. So TMS, dosing people are things that are common in the literature. Non-consented neuroenhancement. So as a broker specialised in speed trading, makes, I nearly said speed dating there. I should say, for me, it's currently 5 o'clock in the morning. So words come out in a strange order. I will apologise. Employees have to be constantly alert. Therefore, he secretly spikes strengths and psychostimulant, increasing vigilance, awareness, and motivation. So my response when I looked through this paper and some of the others was, I was just thinking, is the mind and the body being conflated here? Because it seems to me if we're going to talk seriously and clearly about a right to mental integrity, we should have some sort of reasonable ability to demarcate the things that fall under the scope of bodily integrity and the things that fall under the right to mental integrity. And it's quite problematic, I think, the way that it's described in some of the literature for a few reasons. Tom mentions the work on the embodied mind and philosophy of mind, but I think it's a kind of bigger, broader issue than that. And I've sort of been half expecting the ghost of Wild to reappear and reminds the ghost of machine, because arguably the first great book on the philosophy of mind was The Concept of Mind by Gilbert Ryle, and one of his claims was to try and redescribe the mind, or the Cartesian mind, in terms of dispositions in a bodily way. So there's this big strand in analytic philosophy. You can go back to Locke and Hume. They were grounding mental life and the direct experience of the world. Franz Brentano is a sort of interesting figure because he's at the beginning of existentialism. If you look through a number of works on the philosophy of mind, so Searle, Dennett, many other philosophers of mind will refer to Brentano and Brentano's thesis, which I've stated here. So Brentano thought that all and only mental states are characterised by intentionality. And by that, he didn't mean purposiveness. What he meant was it's a feature of our conscious lives that it involves the directedness of our consciousness onto contents. So I can have I'm aware of this paper cup here, and according to Brentano, what's occurring is my conscious awareness is being directed towards an object under an intentional object that's in the world. And the same is true of my body. I'm aware that my feet are slightly cold as well. And when I'm thinking about my feet, my consciousness is directed towards an intentional object. Now, the reason this matters is because if it's true that, well, people argue against Brentano's thesis, but if it's true that a great proportion of our mental life involves the directedness of our consciousness towards either intentional objects in the body or in the world, then the mind becomes much closer to the body. And then I'm wondering about, well, how do we demarcate bodily and mental integrity? So that idea of Brentano travels through into existentialism. That's a picture of Sartre with his hand on Simone de Beauvoir's shoulder, possibly trying to make sure that gun fires in that direction. But they talked about intentionality as well in Brentano's sense. Merleau-Ponty is possibly really quite relevant for this debate, because one of the things that's a feature of his existentialism was he analysed very carefully the relationship between conscious awareness and the body. So here he says, my existence as subjectivity, consciousness, is merely one with my existence as a body and with the existence of the world. So for Merleau-Ponty, awareness, conscious awareness, is very closely tied in towards bodily and physical awareness. And it's particularly relevant for this context because a number of his remarks about embodiment explain in a very nice way the physical experience of having clinical depression. So he gives a very nice bodily account of what it is to be depressed. So one of the ways in which our mental lives might be interfered with is via shifting moods, such as depressed mood. And what that really amounts to is changing the way in which we engage with our body. Then I'm struggling to distinguish bodily and mental integrity. So Tom's mentions the embodied mind work that's occurred in recent years. And I think it's worth just quickly mentioning this because for Rowland, one of the key ideas is that mental states and processes are not just things that happen inside our brains, they're also things that happen partly in our bodies and even partly in the world outside our bodies. This qualification partly is obvious, crucial, ignored with surprising frequency. The idea, rather, is that in the case of some mental processes, but not all, part of the mental process, but never all, is made up of factors that occur outside the brain of the subject. So that's, again, another reason for conflating that distinction. He also talks about Cartesian materialism, and Daniel Dennett has talked about Cartesian materialism, suggested that it's not so much of a position, but more of a cliff over which to shove one's opponents. And that's certainly what Dennett has done with it. And I think some of the things that are said in the debate about the right to mental integrity are Cartesian materialist accounts of the mind. So Rowlands observes that many people, when they're thinking about Descartes, will think that the problem is the mind is somehow out here and it's non-extended and it's a non-physical thing. But the second aspect of the Cartesian mind is that it's something that somehow exists inside the head. So Dennett has this idea of the Cartesian theatre where everything comes together in this little something in there looking at everything that's going on. And that's what he's getting at here. It's the view there's a crucial finish line or boundary somewhere in the brain marking a place where the order of arrival equals the order of presentation experience. So if we look at Craig, who's responding to Douglas and Forsberg, he wants to deduct this. He says, it's important to note, shifting focus from body to mind, the right to mental integrity does not suggest a dualist model in which mind and body are separate substances. Rather, it acknowledges that the mind is generated and sustained by the brain as one component of the body. So he kind of is locating the mind in the brain and trying to sort of duck the substance dualism aspect of Cartesian dualism. Buglitz and Merkel just come out and say it. When neurotechnologies promise to enable us to surmount the natural bodies of the mind, the skull, and to modulate the inward workings of the mind, the situation of the law has profoundly changed. So something has to kind of go on in terms of demarcating these more carefully. So Tom's changed this view from this paper. Here's an example from their chapter where they're talking about antidepressant and anti-asthmatic. And the thought is that the barista who slips in some antidepressant into the morning coffee with the result someone's mood is somewhat lifted has done something quite different from the barista who notices that someone's a little wheezy but slips some mild, short and fast-acting anti-asthmatic medication into their coffee. The thought is that only the antidepressant case infringes an additional duty, so is more seriously wrong. I can kind of see that the first case looks more seriously wrong. It seems like a kind of more alarming, both more alarming case. But I don't have an intuition that there's something substantively different in terms of the right to mental integrity between the two cases, because even with the anti-asthmatic case, someone's breathing eases, their awareness of the world has changed in the light of the treatment. Well, it seems to me analogous to a lightening of mood and being able to get around and move more quickly. So, going to go past this. So Tom's changed his view about touching being required for bodily integrity. I want to mention this case quickly. So there have been 3 fluoridation cases in New Zealand over recent years. I was involved in the first one. And what happened in the first case and in the Court of Appeal was the right to refuse to undergo medical treatment was at stake. And the court said that in the case of fluoridation, because the council put fluoride in the drinking water and people have the ability to turn off the tap at the gate, it's not a direct impingement upon the body. So the right to bodily integrity is not violated. In the Supreme Court judgment, they said this. So section 11 is the right to refuse medical treatment, which talks about bodily integrity. So logical reason to exclude from scope of section 11, indirect medical treatment, which can affect bodily integrity as much as direct treatment. So I suppose it raises also a methodological point about the debate about the scope of bodily integrity, where maybe we could kind of look to what's happening in the courts in terms of figuring that. So I'm kind of going through this really fast because I've got too much to say. How am I going?
All right. Yeah, you've got another 5 minutes.
Oh, cool. Right, so Douglas and Forsberg note that it's going to be tricky to specify the scope of the right, partly because of the difficulties defining the boundaries of the mind, and part because it's unclear which kinds of non-consensual interference with mind infringe the right to mental integrity. Well, I think so too, and it makes me wonder whether we should persist with the mental part of mental integrity and whether there's something else that we might call it. And I was struck by your talk this morning, and so a couple of people have talked about what's really at stake with bodily integrity is a kind of an assault to the person. And it seems to me that the affronts to mental integrity that are discussed here really seem quite similar. So I'm wondering whether we need to just expand the scope of bodily integrity in some way. Okay, so I'm on to the second bit. A few years ago, and they do connect, I think, I wrote a paper talking about surgical castration. This was motivated by a European report into what's happening in the Czech Republic and in some Eastern European countries where sex offenders were being offered physical and chemical castration. And one of the things that I was thinking about was, well, under what kind of conditions might that be ethically acceptable? And I came across this passage from the beginning of the Republic, where there's a kind of, there's a dialogue about, doesn't it? isn't it a drag to get old? And the argument's put forward that, well, in old age, you get a great deal of peace and freedom from things like sex. When the desires lose their intensity and ease up, then what happens is absolutely as Sophocles described, freedom from a great many demented masters. So the thought was, for some people in old age, there's a freedom from more intense desires. And if somebody is a sex offender and has found their life to be kind of ruled by passions of this sort, if there was a transformation resulting from chemical or physical castration that led to something like that, would that necessarily be a bad thing in terms of their well-being? And I went through to consider a number of different things. So what I was kind of interested in was the relationship between agency and how we respond to different events in the world and hormones in particular. So I was interested in this case. Conversion therapy is a problematic case for me because I want to say that's bad, but I was also interested in pharmacologically induced changes to agency, which is something that I've written about before. This is an ancient book, so I wrote about this in my PhD, so it's over 25 years ago. And it's kind of interesting because we don't think of Prozac as this miracle drug anymore. Peter Kramer was one of the first psychiatrists to use it and talked about a patient he had who had this remarkable transition after taking Prozac. And when he started to tailor her off Prozac, she came in and said, "I'm not myself." So she very quickly came to identify the person that she was when taking Prozac. And when he removed that medication, she found that she wasn't the person that she thought she ought to be. There's another patient he saw Philip, who felt better than well. He wasn't troubled by things and hated it, had been robbed of his disdain, his hatred, and his alienation. So what I was interested in is, well, what might this say about authenticity and alienation, and how might we think about it from the point of view of well-being theory? I think Robert Nozick was possibly the most suave of all my and this is, I still think, a truly great book. Before the Matrix and everything else. So this is an objection to a simple version of hedonism, which is the idea that what makes one's life go well is positive mental states, pleasures, and the privation of pain. So it might be hard to find a historical figure. In fact, thought that Bentham might be the closest. What Nozick says is that if you had a machine that could provide you with optimal experiences and the most pleasure that you want, you wouldn't plug in and live your life inside it. And of course, it's open to debate about whether or not you would, but that's the answer that he gives. Now, in interpreting that, I think what he's getting at is that it's not just pleasurable mental states that contribute to well-being. As Nozick observes, what we want is to kind of live actively and engagement with the world. So if we think that experiences are unreal or not veridical, then that's, for many of us, a problem in terms of how we evaluate. It's quite a nice example by Wayne Sumner from his book on welfare, happiness and ethics, about someone who gets the feeling that his son was killed in the war in a bad way and ends up asking the soldier who saw his son die how, in fact, about the circumstances surrounding her death. So she writes in that encounter, "I would have given 10 years of my life to have been able to not ask, but bargains like that can't be made. Either you're the sort of person who can hide from things or else you're not. I'd rather be so unhappy, I want to die, and see the facts and look them in the face than delude myself." So she wanted to know the truth concerning the nature of her son's death. So the last sort of bit of this thought really is to draw on Aristotle, where he's talking about virtue. I'm not particularly interested in virtue here, but there's something in his observation, and when it comes to assessing our reactions to events, most of us will have a way in which we would like ourselves to react to things and to feel in given situations. So in the case of anger, Aristotle thinks the virtuous person is mild. So he's someone who is capable of feeling anger, but is generally not led by feeling or irritated by reason, prescribes and length of time prescribed. So someone who is more in the direction of efficiency. So Aristotle has this idea of kind of mean states for the passions or the virtues. And my thought is, well, these for many people are open to change. So thinking about someone like Tess or Erasmus, well, Tess in particular, it's the case that a medication changes the way in which she's responding to the world and a set of dispositions on her behalf. And it's consistent with a personal narrative about the kind of person that she should be. Then that doesn't seem to be, in my view, violating her integrity as an agent. And we might say the same thing about someone who uses, a sex offender who successfully uses chemical or physical castration to become the person that they thought they should be. So that's the thought, is that while our the ways in which we respond can change because of stimuli of that sort, I don't think that it necessarily violates the authenticity or veridicality experience. And that's when the new reactions fit within means for that person that they now endorse. One of the reasons that I was thinking about this, and we've talked quite a bit about right to bodily integrity and the right to mental integrity and consent, is in the case of the Czech sex offenders and that report, I was concerned about consent being a sufficient condition for it. If we're interested in well-being, getting it right, it's something stronger than that. It's a judgment about the likelihood of somebody doing something which ends up resulting in change to that person and it fitting it into a revised self-conception.